Boris Johnson, as you may have noticed, made an energy announcement a little bit earlier on today. You saw that in the news. It marks his final major speech, really, as Prime Minister. It's certainly been an eventful premiership, with Britain standing up to Russia over the war in Ukraine, getting Brexit done, and of course having to deal with a global pandemic in which the UK led the way in helping to create the first reliable vaccine. But Boris Johnson also leaves office amid a cost of living crisis and a series of scandals, which in the end brought down his premiership, including a fine by the Metropolitan Police. I've been looking back at Boris Johnson's political career, and here is my take on his last 3 years in office, but also his political career before that as well.
I have just been to see Her Majesty the Queen, who has invited me to form a government, and I have accepted. The doubters, the doomsters, the gloomsters, they are going to get it wrong again. The people who bet against Britain are going to lose their shirts, because we're going to restore trust in our democracy.
As a child, he wanted to be king of the world, and for a time, Boris Johnson was indeed Conservative Party royalty. Imperious in his ambitions and commanding in his successes, getting Brexit done and vaccinating the nation. But for the people of Britain, that crown has now slipped. Dethroned over his failures, the victim of a coup of his own making. In many ways, he was an unlikely Prime Minister, a career built on a series of colourful media stunts.
Who says we can't organise gold medals?
Many of them planned, others less so. An everyman appeal, people seemed to overlook his privileged education at Eton and Oxford. He had a talent rare in politics. To be able to laugh at himself.
I'm so sorry. Are you okay?
But many weren't laughing. He was dogged by claims he was unfit for the office of Prime Minister, a charlatan, a joker, more interested in power than governing. A man of no conviction, said his critics, from cosmopolitan London mayor to a tough on-borders Brexiteer. And then there was his personal life, unconventional, that must be said for a Prime Minister. Married 3 times, a father to at least 7, a serial adulterer who once was locked out of his home by a former wife, to the glee of the waiting paparazzi.
Covering the fields with their car parks, they dominate the landscape.
He started his career as a journalist, quickly embroiling himself in a string of controversies over, among other things, made-up quotes. But his exuberance, particularly in criticising the European Union, was getting him noticed. Became a regular on the BBC show Have I Got News For You?
Boris Johnson.
And by 1999, he was the editor of The Spectator. But now Boris Johnson was a celebrity, and in 2001 he was elected Conservative MP for Henley. He later supported his long-term frenemy from Oxford, David Cameron, to the leadership of the party. But Boris Johnson's political ambitions went well beyond Parliament. In 2008 he was elected as the Mayor of London, an unlikely Tory leader for a Labour-supporting city. He took on bendy buses, promoted cycling, his famous Boris bikes, and championed a global cosmopolitan London. And his star rose even further, achieving the status of an international figure as London hosted its enormously successful Olympics and Paralympics in 2012. Boris Johnson was by now a global name, with many thinking he was a Prime Minister waiting.
Boris Johnson is duly elected.
3 years later, he was back in Parliament, re-elected as an MP for a West London seat.
Thank you very much.
Many saw it as a direct challenge to David Cameron's Remainer premiership, and it was. The question of Brexit was now consuming Britain, and Boris Johnson was torn. He famously drafted 2 articles for The Telegraph, one in favour of leave, another backing Remain. Ultimately, after a career ridiculing the EU, he decided to put his money where his mouth was and support Brexit.
The last thing I wanted was to go against David Cameron or the government. But after a great deal of heartache, I don't think there's anything else I can do. I will be advocating vote leave.
The Leave campaign was scrappy, divided and deadly effective. With Johnson as its mascot, if not its leader, its rallies were electric, harnessing the superstar power of the Boris effect. It culminated in a sensational win for the underdog campaign and a pivotal moment in British history with reverberations around the world. Cameron was out and the race to be the next Prime Minister was on. But it was now that Boris Johnson's luck seemed to have run out. Betrayed by his close friend Michael Gove, who launched his own bid for number 10.
Having consulted colleagues and in view of the circumstances in Parliament, I have concluded that person cannot be me.
Theresa May's premiership got off to a strong start. Party united and energised by her tough talk on getting out of the EU. For Boris Johnson, he found himself a step closer to the throne, appointed Foreign Secretary to the derision of some. For a while, Mrs May seemed unassailable, but her backbenchers plotted, suspicious of the former Remainer in number 10 and critical of her approach to a Brexit deal with Brussels. A snap election was called to boost the numbers of her allies in Parliament.
Strong and stable leadership.
But it was a disaster. May now led a minority government with a civil war in her own party. Boris Johnson, champion of the Brexiteers, sensationally resigned.
It is not too late to save Brexit.
Mrs May's deal with Brussels was quickly falling apart. By the summer of 2019, May was out, and Johnson got his second opportunity to grab the keys to number 10. This time, he was unbeatable. And despite a concerted Stop Boris campaign by Tory Remainers, he sailed to victory, supreme in his popularity among the party base.
Therefore, I give notice that Boris Johnson is elected as the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party.
But Mrs May's supporters were now the rebels, and deadlock in the Commons over a Brexit deal continued. The new Prime Minister, who'd promised to get Brexit done, called another snap election. And voters clamouring for an end to the Brexit saga and deeply suspicious of Labour under its hard left leader, Jeremy Corbyn, granted Boris Johnson a landslide. With his promises to level up the country, he smashed the so-called Red Wall, those historically Labour seats in the Midlands and the North, which had always seemed unwinnable to the Conservatives. Weeks after that election victory, Boris Johnson kept his promise to voters by getting Brexit done, a Christmas trade deal with the EU.
The noes to the left, 234.
Though for some that deal was a sellout, bringing up a new border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But that triumph was short-lived. Worrying stories of a new virus from China started to emerge. Entire cities locked down to stop the spread. Soon there were desperate reports from hospital front lines in Italy. Case numbers were soaring, ICU wards overwhelmed. And then the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, arrived in Britain. Johnson's initial response appeared to be keep calm and carry on. The apocalyptic tones of reports from elsewhere would not happen here. That's what the line seemed to be.
I think 20 seconds would be sufficient.
But inevitably the Prime Minister's cheerful libertarianism collapsed in the face of relentless briefings from his scientific advisors.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very
Any
much.
hope of a policy of herd immunity was gone.
And I thank you all.
Boris Johnson gave an order to the British public that he'd never envisaged.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
He had hoped it would be a short-term measure. Britain would become a world leader in test and trace, we were told. A vaccine was on the way, the Prime Minister insisted. But then the unthinkable happened. He was hospitalised with the virus. Reports emerged that the Prime Minister was on a ventilator. There were whispered conversations in Whitehall that he could be about to die. For a few hours, it seemed that no one was in control. Boris Johnson did, however, recover, and for those among the public yet to encounter the deadly effect of coronavirus, well, the crisis really did seem more real. The virus was becoming better understood, and at a boost to the Prime Minister, Britain beat the world to a reliable vaccine, produced at cost price by AstraZeneca with research from Oxford University. And when Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, Britain again led the world, standing up to Russia's aggression.
How are you? Nice to see you. I'm very, very, very glad to see you.
The Prime Minister was lauded in Kyiv and globally for sending weapons, money and support. To Downing Street's delight, the Kremlin effectively labelled him enemy number one. But it was the actions of the Prime Minister's staff, and indeed Boris Johnson himself, which sealed his fate in the minds of the public. First, there was the infamous lockdown-breaking trip to Barnard Castle by the Prime Minister's fearsome advisor Dominic Cummings, with his bizarre half-apology. Then it emerged that Number 10 had hosted garden parties, birthday cakes, quizzes and suitcases loaded with booze. There was the smirking admissions of festive parties, just as people were told not to see their loved ones at Christmas.
And it was not socially distanced.
And the damning evidence that the Prime Minister himself and those closest to him had broken the COVID rules they themselves had set. Multiple investigations were launched, including by the police, with more than 120 fines issued, and Boris Johnson becoming the first ever sitting Prime Minister to find to have broken the law.
I understand the anger that many will feel that I myself fell short when it came to observing the very rules which the government I lead had introduced to protect the public. And I accept in all sincerity that people had the right to expect better.
Crises followed like London buses. There were stories of drug abuse and porn watching by Tory MPs. Boris Johnson's time seemed to be running out. He was damaged by a narrower than hoped confidence vote.
That the Parliamentary Party does have confidence.
And devastated by an onslaught of by-election losses. And then his final mistake. Accused of lying after claims of sexual assault were made against a colleague. An avalanche of resignations followed, culminating in his own.
And I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks.
For Boris Johnson's long-term critics, it ended as they always said it would. A joke figure, deeply unsuited to high office, thrust into one of the most serious crises Britain has ever faced. But for supporters, he was precisely what the country needed. A breezy, sunny optimist who took on the establishment and won. A patriot who truly believes in the potential of Great Britain. And a conservative who smashed the red wall. How history will remember him will depend on the coming months and years. But for now, Boris Johnson's party is finally over, and the hangover has just begun.